I wrote that piece to highlight a very dangerous trend, in my opinion, is that many people in the West buy into Russian propaganda, which is saying that Euromaidan is infiltrated by the neo-Nazis and anti-Semites. And this is completely untrue. There is a far-right element in Euromaidan protests, but it is a minor element. And Euromaidan protest is basically a multicultural democratic movement which is trying to build a new Ukraine, a democratic Ukraine. And sometimes by the name far-right, there goes Ukrainian nationalism. And Ukrainian nationalism has its main thrust is building of a truly independent Ukraine, a Ukraine which would be a national democratic state and not a colony of Russia, as Ukrainian nationalists think Ukraine is. So the move towards Europe is a move towards democracy and away from the authoritarianism of Russia and its projected Eurasian Union, which would unite several authoritarian states like Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Russia. So Ukrainians do not want this. They want to be away from authoritarianism, and they struggle for democracy now in Ukraine. So basically, Ukraine is now a front line of democratic Europe. And Ukrainians are not only fighting for their own freedom, but they are fighting to stop authoritarianism to spread westwards.
Stephen Cohen, what is your take on what's happening in Ukraine right now?
Well, it's not what Anton said. Where to begin? Can we begin at the beginning? What's happening in Ukraine, what's been unfolding since November in the streets, is probably the single most important international story underway today. It may impact for a very long time the geopolitics of Europe, Russia, American-Russian relations, and a lot more. At the same time, media coverage of this story, particularly in the United States, has been exceedingly misleading. Very close to what Anton just told you. I would characterize Anton's characterization, to be as polite as I can, as half-true. But a half-truth is an untruth. The realities are there is no the Ukraine. All this talk about Ukraine is on the front line of democracy. There are at least two Ukraines. One tilts toward Poland and Lithuania, the West, the European Union. The other toward Russia. This is not my notion. This is what every public opinion poll has told us since this crisis unfolded. That about 40% of Ukrainians want to go west, 40% want to stay with Russia, and it is usually true in these polls, 20% just don't know, or they're not sure. Who precipitated this crisis? It was the European Union, in this sense. It gave the Ukrainian government, which, by the way, is a democratically elected government. If you overthrow this government, just like they overthrew Morsi in Egypt, you're dealing a serious blow to democracy. So if the crowd manages to essentially carry out a coup d'etat from the streets, that's what democracy is not about. But here's what the European Union did back in November. It told the government of Ukraine, if you want to sign an economic relationship with us, you cannot sign one with Russia. Why not? Putin said, why don't the three of us have an arrangement? We'll help Ukraine, the West will help Ukraine. The Chancellor of Germany, Merkel, at first thought that was a good idea, but she backed down for various political reasons. So essentially, Ukraine was giving an ultimatum. Sign the EU economic agreement, or else. Now, what was that agreement? It would have been an economic catastrophe for Ukraine. I'm not talking about the intellectuals or the people who are well-placed, about ordinary Ukrainians. The Ukrainian economy is on the brink of a meltdown. It needed billions of dollars. What did the European Union offer them? The same austerity policies that are ravaging Europe, and nothing more, $600 million. It needed billions and billions. There's one other thing. If you read the protocols of the European offer to Ukraine, which has been interpreted in the West as just about civilizational change, escaping Russia, economics, democracy, there is a big clause on military cooperation. In effect, by signing this, Ukraine would have had to abide by NATO's military policies. What would that mean? That would mean drawing a new Cold War line, which used to be in Berlin, right through the heart of Slavic civilization on Russia's borders. So that's where we're at to now. One other point. These right-wing people, whom Anton thinks are not significant, all reports, and I don't know when he was in Ukraine, maybe it was long ago and things had developed, but the reports that are coming out of Ukraine are the following. One, the moderates, that's the former heavyweight champion boxer Vitaly Klitschko and others, have lost control of the street. They've asked the people who have been attacking the police with Molotov cocktails and to vacate the buildings they've occupied to stop, and the street will not stop. Partly because, I'd say largely because, the street in Kiev is now controlled by these right-wing extremists. And that extremism has spread to western Ukraine, where these people are occupying government buildings. So in fact, you have a political civil war underway. What is the face of these people, this right wing? A, they hate Europe as much as they hate Russia. Their official statement is Europe is homosexuals, Jews, and the decay of the Ukrainian state. They want nothing to do with Europe. They want nothing to do with Russia. I'm talking about this, it's not a fringe, but this very right-wing thing. What does their political activity include? It includes writing on buildings in western Ukraine, Jews live here. That's exactly what the Nazis wrote on the homes of Jews when they occupied Ukraine. A priest who represents part of the political movement in western Ukraine, Putin quoted this, but it doesn't make it false. It doesn't make it false. It's been verified. A West Ukrainian priest said, "We, Ukraine, will not be governed by Negroes, Jews, or Russians." So these people have now come to the fore. The first victims of any revolution, I don't know if this is a revolution, but the first victims of any revolution are the moderates. And the moderates have lost control of what they created, helped by the European Union and the American government back in November. And so now anything is possible, including two Ukraines.
Anton Chekhosov, can you respond to Professor Stephen Cohen?
Yes, so this is basically what I said as a distortion in the Western media. I don't know if Professor Cohen have been in Ukraine. I've been to Ukraine just a few days ago. I haven't seen that the right-wingers have taken control of the streets. The streets are controlled by Euromaidan, which is ideologically very different. There is a right-wing element, but this is the element which is only a minor component of Euromaidan. And if you remember the solidarity movement in the 80s in Poland, it also comprised some right-wing elements. But in the end, they built a democratic national democratic Poland. As for the neo-Nazis and anti-Semites in Western Ukraine, there are some. But at the same time, if you talk to them, if you interview them, and if you read their demands, you will not find any discrimination laws among their demands. What they demand is the national democratic state, independent from Russia. Even if they say that they are against the European Union, they at the same time support the pro-European protests. And this is partly what Euromaidan is about. And then again, there are many false reports about the beatings of representatives of national minorities in Ukraine. And mostly these reports are all false. They are being spread by Russian-backed propagandists, like Viktor Medvedchuk, leader of the pro-Eurasian, pro-Russian party Ukrainsky Vybor, Ukrainian Choice. So these people, they are trying to distort the image of Euromaidan and picture it as something very violent, as something very right-wing. Although the right-wing element, as I said, is a minor element at Euromaidan.
Professor Richard Cohen.
Stephen.
Professor Stephen Cohen.
Richard Cohen writes for the Washington Post. We are completely different
But
people.
he's not a professor, so.
Well, we're still different people.
Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Amy.
Can you respond to what he's saying and also talk about how people are informed here, largely through the media coverage of what's happening in Ukraine?
I've already responded to what Anton has said. To me, it's a fundamental misrepresentation, and it raises questions in my mind, though he's entitled to his political allegiances, who he represents in Ukraine. He's clear where he stands. But even the American media, which deleted this right-wing element for 2 months, now has gotten worried about it. There's an article in Time magazine, I think the day before yesterday, I think, because I saw it on the internet, but today's New York Times, January 30th, New York Times editorial, is now worried about these people. So Anton's not worried about them for his own reasons. But the plain reality is that the so-called moderates, who are democratic, have lost control of the situation. And here's the evidence. The moderate leaders, including Klitschko, the boxer who wants to be president of Ukraine, entered into a negotiation with Yanukovych, the democratically elected president of Ukraine. And what did he offer them? He offered them a coalition government, which is a traditional democratic solution to such a crisis. He said, we will give Klitschko and the other Ukrainian democratic leader the prime ministership and the deputy prime ministership. That's a colossal concession. It's power sharing. That's what you do in a crisis. They didn't accept. Now, they didn't accept for several reasons.
The protesters didn't accept.
No, wait a minute. Klitschko and the other democratic leader didn't accept. One reason, the main reason, is the street wouldn't accept it. And since both of these guys want to be president when there's elections in 2015, if there are elections, they're not going to go against the street. They become captives of the street. Now, the street, increasingly, is in the control of these right-wingers. Let me make a point, and it'd be interesting to hear what Anton thinks about this. Many young thugs in the street are trying to kill policemen. They're throwing Molotov cocktails at them. They're beating them up. Now, the police are brutal also. But name me one democratic country that would allow mobs to attack policemen in the street of a capital city and not crack down. And in fact, the Ukrainian police haven't cracked down.
Anton Chekhovsov, your response.
Well, the police has already cracked down on the protesters at the end of November, when peaceful protesters were brutally beaten by the riot police. They did not do anything except for staying on the Independence Square in Kiev, and they were beaten up, and some people have disappeared. And since then, since the end of November, there are dozens of people who have been kidnapped by the police, and now they are found sometimes frozen to death with their hands tied at their backs. So there is a whole campaign of state terror going on in Ukraine, and more than 5 people were killed already. And Arseniy Yatsenyuk, one of the politicians whom Professor Cohen called the moderates, he was offered a position of prime minister, but Ukraine is a presidential republic, so the whole power, the whole political power, is in the hands of President Viktor Yanukovych. So this position is not really powerful. Prime Minister does not have any influence on politics and on the way Ukraine develops.
Amy,
so it wasn't really a concession.
Yeah. Anton may have been in Ukraine a week ago, but he's completely out of touch. Part of the deal that Yanukovych offered the moderates was to change the Constitution to deprive the president of the power he now has and switch it to the prime minister.
This is completely untrue.
So
this is simply untrue.
Well, it's not untrue. I mean, I've read the documents, I read the speech. It hasn't gone through. It's still at the parliament. They may vote on it, they may not. But you're simply not representing the situation correctly.
Well, I am representing the situation correctly because I've been there. I've seen all the documents that were being discussed in the parliament. And President Yanukovych never offered to go back to the constitution of 2004, which would reintroduce the parliamentary republic. He wants all the power he's got during 3 years of his rule. He has now a control of all the oligarchic business in Ukraine. He was trying to build the whole business empire and give his family and the oligarchs and businessmen connected to the family all the economic power in Ukraine. So of course he's now will be fighting till death, because if he loses, his family is will lose all the money that they've stolen from Ukrainian people and invested it in European banks, invested it in European businesses, as well as American businesses as well.
I want to get Stephen Cohen's response to last month Senators John McCain and Christopher Murphy visiting the protesters at their hub in Kiev's Independence Square and voicing support for their cause.
We are here to tell you that the American people and the United States Congress stands with the people of Ukraine.
I am a Republican. Senator Murphy is a Democrat. We are here together speaking for the American people in solidarity with you.
Professor Stephen Cohen.
Well, that's Anton's position. I mean, Anton represents at least his description of the situation, the mainstream American media political view of what's going on in Ukraine. And when I say mainstream, I mean it extends from the right wing in America to MSNBC, to the so-called liberals and progressives, to Bill Maher, who did this on his show the other night. There's no alternative voice in America except what I'm trying to say to you today. It's wrong. It's wrong factually. It's wrong in terms of policy. For McCain to go, as he's done in other countries, he once said we're all Georgians, now he's saying we're all Ukrainians. If he understands the situation in Ukraine, and he may not, then he's being reckless. But a true understanding of Ukraine begins with the fact that there are at least two Ukraines, two legitimate Ukraines, culturally, politically, ethnically, economically, culturally. This isn't Putin's fault. This isn't Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine's fault. It's either God's fault or it's history's fault. This is what came down through the centuries. This situation has been explosive since the end of the Soviet Union 22 years ago. When Western politicians go there, they're playing with fire, metaphorically, and now they have real fire.
You think this is about the media's vilification of Putin?
I think that the vilification of Putin in this country, demonization, is the worst press coverage by the American media of Russia that I've seen in my 40 years of studying Russia and contributing to the media. It's simply almost insane. This idea that he's a thug and that explains everything passes for analysis in America today.
We have to leave it there.